My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 59 years old. And if you'd driven through the little farming town of Ashford, Vermont, a year ago, you probably would have missed my workshop without even realizing it. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't painted in bright colors. And it certainly wasn't the kind of place tourists stop to take selfies. It was an old timber building with weathered cedar siding, hand-forged hinges, and a chimney that had been breathing smoke into the same sky since the late 1800s. My great-grandfather built it with his own hands after returning from the railroad camps, and every generation after him left something behind inside those walls. A hammer, a journal, a workbench, even the tiny pencil marks measuring children's heights on one corner post. People always assumed I was preserving antique tools because they were valuable. Truth is, I wasn't saving the tools. I was saving the people who once held them. Every dent in an old blacksmith's hammer, every worn wooden handle, every tiny scratch had a story. And somewhere along the way, I realized history disappears a little at a time whenever someone decides profit matters more than memory. That's why museums hired me. That's why historical societies trusted me. And that's why my workshop eventually earned a state preservation designation. I never imagined that little certificate hanging on my wall would one day send a billionaire's favorite executive to prison. The morning everything changed started with a sound that didn't belong. It wasn't birds. It wasn't wind through the maple trees. It was diesel. Loud, impatient diesel, vibrating through the windows before the sun had even cleared the hills. I glanced at the clock beside my bed. 5:18. Nobody respectable showed up at 5:18 unless someone had died. I pulled on my boots, grabbed my old denim jacket, and stepped onto the porch just as floodlights swept across my yard. For a second, I honestly thought I was dreaming. A massive bulldozer sat halfway up my driveway while two pickup trucks blocked the road behind it. Men in reflective vests were walking around carrying clipboards like they owned the place. One of them looked up, waved casually, and yelled, "Morning, sir. Emergency structural removal. You'll want to stand back." I laughed because it sounded ridiculous. "Emergency?" I asked. "Whose emergency?" He shrugged without even looking me in the eye. "County order." That answer didn't sit right with me. I'd lived on that land my entire life. The county inspector hunted deer with my brother every November. If there had been an emergency, somebody would have called. I reached for my phone before another worker stepped between me and the building. "Sir, we're authorized to proceed." "Authorized by who?" I asked. Silence. Just awkward glances between workers who suddenly became very interested in their boots. Then the bulldozer lurched forward. I remember yelling. I honestly don't remember what I said. Maybe their names. Maybe every curse word I'd ever learned. Maybe nothing at all. The steel blade kissed the front wall for half a second. Then the entire corner exploded into splintered beams and flying bricks. 130 years of family history collapsed with a sound I'll probably hear for the rest of my life. Dust rolled across the yard like fog. Shelves disappeared. Windows shattered. My grandfather's forge vanished beneath broken timber before I could even reach it. I kept screaming for them to stop, but engines don't listen to old men. By 6 o'clock, there was nothing left except twisted roofing, smashed anvils, shattered display cases, and years of restoration work buried under piles of debris. I walked through the rubble in complete silence. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't even pick up one of the broken chisels lying near my boots. 20 years restoring history, erased before sunrise. Then something caught my attention. One of the survey markers near the fence line had been crushed by the bulldozer tracks, exposing bright orange paint underneath the dirt. I stared at it longer than I probably should have, because I knew exactly where that marker had come from. 2 years earlier, I'd paid for a professional survey after the neighboring luxury country club started expanding another golf hole behind my property. The survey proved they quietly pushed part of their landscaping several dozen feet onto my land. I'd sent letters, emails, even offered to settle everything peacefully. Every response had been polite, delayed, and ultimately meaningless. "We're reviewing the matter. Our legal department is evaluating your concerns. Thank you for your patience." Funny how patience always seems to benefit the people making millions. I was still standing there when my phone buzzed. It was my old friend Martin, who worked in accounting for the country club's parent company. He sounded nervous before he even said hello. Danny, don't ask how I got this. A photo appeared on my screen seconds later. It was a screenshot of a text conversation between two executives. The final message stopped my breathing. Just level it. Legal can deal with the paperwork later. There wasn't any confusion anymore. There hadn't been a mistake. Nobody mixed up addresses. Nobody misread permits. Somebody had decided my family's history was cheaper to replace than to respect. And in that exact moment, standing ankle-deep in splintered wood where my great-grandfather's workshop had stood since horses outnumbered automobiles, I realized something they never considered. They thought they had destroyed the strongest thing I owned. They were wrong. They had just given me the evidence I needed to destroy everything they had built. For the first hour, I didn't call a lawyer. I didn't call the sheriff. I didn't even call my insurance company. I just sat on the tailgate of my old pickup, covered in dust, staring at what used to be my life's work while neighbors quietly drifted over one by one carrying coffee, blankets, and those awkward expressions people wear when they know there isn't a single sentence that can make things better. Around 8 that morning, the president of the country club finally showed up in a spotless SUV, wearing polished shoes that had never seen a muddy driveway. He stepped out with a smile so rehearsed it almost deserved applause. "Mr. Mercer," he said, extending his hand, "I'm sure we can work out reasonable compensation." I looked at his hand, then at the smoking pile of broken timber behind me. "You know what my grandfather used to say?" I asked. He shook his head. He said a man who reaches for a handshake before offering an apology usually knows he's guilty. His smile disappeared. "Let's not make this emotional." I couldn't help laughing. "You demolished 130 years of my family history before sunrise, and your concern is that I might get emotional?" He climbed back into his SUV without another word. That was the last time anyone from the company tried pretending this had been an accident. By noon, my attorney, Sarah Collins, was standing beside me with work boots on instead of courtroom heels. That's one of the reasons I'd hired her years before for a property dispute. She understood dirt, fence lines, and stubborn people better than marble courtrooms. She spent less than 10 minutes walking through the debris before asking a question that caught me completely off guard. "Daniel, where's the preservation easement file?" I blinked. "Probably in the office cabinet that no longer exists," she smiled. "Good thing I already requested copies from the state archives 6 months ago." That sentence changed everything. 2 days later, we spread maps, surveys, easement agreements, photographs, tax filings, and engineering reports across her conference table until there wasn't an inch of wood left uncovered. The deeper we dug, the uglier the picture became. The country club hadn't simply ignored a property line. They had quietly shifted landscaping, irrigation, maintenance roads, and part of their signature golf hole onto private land because redesigning it legally would have cost far more than gambling on nobody fighting back. Someone in management had made a simple calculation: old craftsman, small workshop, rural address, cheap settlement. End of story. Unfortunately for them, they had chosen exactly the wrong old craftsman. Sarah leaned back in her chair late that evening, tapped one page with her pen, and looked at me with a kind of grin lawyers only get when they smell blood in the water. "Daniel, I don't think this is a civil case anymore." I frowned. Meaning somebody may have lied to the federal government. She explained that the historic preservation agreement attached to the property wasn't just symbolic. It was part of a conservation program tied to substantial tax incentives awarded over multiple years. The entire arrangement depended on maintaining specific historic structures. Destroying one wasn't merely expensive. It could invalidate certifications the company had continued using when filing taxes and regulatory reports. Suddenly, this wasn't about replacing old lumber. It was about whether executives knowingly benefited from protections they had already violated. We filed our civil complaint anyway because that established the timeline. But Sarah also began contacting agencies I'd barely heard of. State preservation officials, environmental compliance officers, federal investigators responsible for cultural resource protections. Every phone call uncovered another thread. Every thread led somewhere bigger. 3 days after the demolition, I hired a fencing crew. The foreman looked over the survey markers and asked, "You sure you want it exactly here?" I nodded. Exactly here. For 2 straight days, sparks flew as steel posts were driven into the ground. Heavy black panels stretched across the property line until a solid fence stood directly through the edge of the country club's championship hole. Golf carts rolled up one after another. Players climbed out, stared at the fence, then turned around muttering to themselves. Some took pictures, others demanded managers explain why a private fairway suddenly ended in a wall of steel. We installed a simple sign beside the gate: "Protected Historic Property. Private land beyond this point. Please direct questions to club management." That sign probably cost $40. It caused hundreds of thousands in embarrassment. Local television stations arrived first, then regional newspapers. Reporters loved visual stories. And there wasn't anything subtle about an expensive golf course suddenly blocked by a fence standing exactly where survey stakes proved it belonged. I didn't chase cameras. They came to me while I swept splinters off the cracked concrete foundation that used to support my forge. One young reporter asked whether revenge motivated everything I was doing. I remember answering without even thinking, "No, revenge would have been burning their clubhouse down. Accountability is making them live with their own decisions." That quote spread faster than I expected. The company responded with glossy press releases describing the demolition as an unfortunate misunderstanding. Then Martin called again. His voice was barely above a whisper. "They're shredding documents." I sat upright. "How do you know?" "Because accounting never shreds anything in the middle of an audit unless somebody's scared." He couldn't send confidential files, and I never asked him to, but he pointed Sarah toward internal approval dates, board meeting minutes, and contract amendments that eventually became public through lawful discovery. Every new record tightened the timeline. Every signature narrowed responsibility. Then came the break none of us saw coming. A retired engineer who had worked on the golf course expansion years earlier contacted Sarah after seeing the story on television. He arrived carrying faded notebooks and rolled-up blueprints. "I kept copies," he said quietly. "Didn't trust management." Those plans showed multiple design revisions. Earlier versions avoided my property entirely. Later revisions crossed directly onto it with handwritten notes estimating how much money the company would save by ignoring the original boundary. Nobody had accidentally drifted across the line. Somebody had approved it. Sarah looked at me after the engineer left and simply said, "Now we have motive." About a week after the bulldozers arrived, federal officials requested access to the site. They photographed everything from the broken stone foundation to fragments of original hand-forged hardware scattered through the dirt. One investigator stopped beside a bent iron hinge I'd restored years earlier. He picked it up carefully and asked, "This original?" I nodded. He slipped it into an evidence bag without another word. That's when I realized the story had moved beyond my little town. It wasn't my fight anymore. It belonged to people whose job was determining whether powerful executives believed the rules only applied to everyone else. Meanwhile, the country club grew strangely quiet. Their attorneys stopped making settlement offers. Their executives stopped giving interviews. Their public relations team disappeared completely. Silence, Sarah told me, was rarely a sign of confidence. It usually meant somebody finally understood how deep the hole really was. And for the first time since that awful morning, I began to suspect that the building they demolished wasn't going to be the only thing reduced to rubble before this was over. About 3 months later, I found myself sitting in the back row of a federal courtroom, wearing the same old brown jacket I'd been wearing the morning my workshop came down. Funny how life works. Some clothes become lucky. Others become witnesses. The courtroom was almost silent except for the shuffle of papers and the occasional whisper between attorneys. Across the room sat the executives who had once acted like they could buy their way through anything. They looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, just emotionally. There's something about knowing every decision you've made is about to be read into the public record that takes the confidence out of a person. One by one, the evidence came together. Internal emails, survey revisions, financial records, approval chains, testimony from employees who had finally decided protecting themselves mattered more than protecting their former bosses. None of it happened because I was smarter than they were. It happened because arrogance leaves fingerprints everywhere. When the lead executive stood to enter his guilty plea, he never looked in my direction. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe he simply didn't want to see the man whose little workshop he dismissed as an inconvenience. The judge spoke calmly, almost conversationally, but every sentence landed like a hammer. Restitution would be paid. Criminal penalties would follow. Additional financial consequences would be determined under separate proceedings. I wasn't celebrating. I wasn't smiling. To be honest, all I could think about was my great-grandfather. I wondered what he'd say if he could have seen that room. Probably something simple like, "Take care of the shop." That's all he'd ever really cared about. Months later, construction crews returned to my property, but this time they weren't carrying demolition equipment. They were carrying reclaimed timber, hand-cut stone, and old-style hardware built to match photographs we'd salvaged from family albums. We didn't build a replica. We rebuilt a legacy. Some of the original beams were too badly damaged to save, but a few survived. I insisted those weathered pieces become part of the new entrance, scars and all. Visitors ask why I didn't replace them with perfect lumber. I tell them perfect wood has never survived anything worth remembering. The country club eventually signed a long-term access agreement for the strip of land they had once assumed they could simply take. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Every month the payment arrived exactly on schedule, and every month I smiled a little, not because of the money, but because respect finally came with paperwork instead of empty promises. A local high school now brings history students to the workshop every spring. I let them hold restored tools, tell them stories about the families who built this town, and remind them that preserving history isn't really about old buildings. It's about refusing to let people with enough money decide which memories deserve to survive. Every now and then someone asks whether I hate the people who destroyed my workshop. I always give the same answer. Hate would have kept me standing in that pile of rubble forever. Justice gave me a reason to keep building. Those are two very different things. There's one photograph hanging near the front door now. It isn't there because I'm proud of somebody else's downfall. It's there because every visitor who walks inside asks about it, and that gives me the chance to tell the entire story from the beginning, about one terrible morning, one terrible decision, and how ordinary people don't have to be powerful to stand their ground. Sometimes all you need is the truth, enough patience to follow it wherever it leads, and the courage to keep going long after everyone else assumes you've already lost. So now, I'd like to ask you something. If someone with more money, more influence, and a team of lawyers tried to erase something your family had protected for generations, would you have walked away with a settlement, or would you have fought all the way to the end? I honestly don't know what the right answer is for everyone, but I know the choice I made changed the rest of my life. Let me know what you think down in the comments. Was this justice? Was it revenge? Or was it something in between? I'd really like to hear where you draw that line. And if this story meant something to you, don't forget to like the video. Subscribe for more real stories about ordinary people standing up when nobody expected them to. And share this with someone who still believes doing the right thing never matters. Sometimes it does, and sometimes it changes everything.